All right, let me make sure I'm unmuted.
Oh,
All right,
muted.
got to make sure I'm unmuted first. All right, well, welcome. I'm going to give this talk, and we'll go probably for the whole time, which will be kind of nice. Might cover diseases that you'll never experience. In New York, we have temperate tropical weather. At least it seems that way. Not today. It's about 19 at the high, and we're going into some colder weather. So, but we do get a lot of rain, and so if I talk too much about rainy things, that's why you brought a pillow, right? Let's do it. So I'm going to talk about everything that we do and what I advise our growers to do for apple disease management season long. And it'll cover everything from horticulture, resistance, and maybe stuff you never see. But let's hope you don't. But if you do, a lot of the same stuff that I'll be talking about today will apply to almost any other disease problems you have. All right, let's jump in and see what we got. Boop. I'll use the laser pointer today. It might make things a little easier. That way I can sort of point with stuff. The first part is general disease management. This is the stuff that if you do this, it will stop a lot of the problems. The biggest problems in New York are apple scab and fire blight. And after that, we'll talk about all the other weird things that we end up having. Other diseases. And you may have some of these other tree fruit diseases as well. So let's dive right in. Let's don't waste any time or waste your time and talk about it. The best way to beat this stuff is making this window really tiny. There we go. That's better. All right. Best things to do is always listen to the horticulturalist. Start there first. And then if you haven't moved to the high density plantings, that's going to be the best step that you have for both your production, fruit quality, as well as disease management. These high density plantings, that's just shown over here on the right, are easy. They're better for color, better yield per acre, because these trees are pushing out apples like chickens in packed cages. Agrochemical applications are easier to apply. There's better drying time and air circulation. Despite all the pesticides we've developed over the years, air is definitely the best one. All of these diseases love water, and they love moisture and little cracks and darkness. And so if you can relieve that, you're doing good. So this is a traditional tall spindle orchard here. We have most of this in New York has switched to this style. I tried to find pictures of what it traditionally looked like, an old tall spindle planting at about 300 trees to the acre on semi-dwarf. I found these in China. This is very common. They put bags on the fruit. You want to know why? Because this air circulation is so poor and the canopy is so dense that they have to bag every fruit in order for them to protect against disease. This is still a haven and a mess of disease problems compared to this orchard there. Both of them were in Shanxi province in China, and this is what we're moving to in New York. Most of New England has sort of stayed away from this a little bit. But even if you're having a pick your own, you can reach the top of this tree, and the families and people that come to your operations are going to want to pick from this. They're real easy to see, real easy to get. No ladders, no lawsuits. Everyone is happy. Along these lines, you got to pick the best site. You may not have a choice of land. You may only be given the land that you've got. But when you're there, pick the best spots. And if you can, use drainage tile. If you don't know what that is, you'll look it up and you'll see like elephant trunk and all of these other things, or even old clay tiles, anything to get that water out of your orchards. And with these new trees, you want them pumping out lots of fruit, so manage that drip irrigation. There's a couple of different pictures here. If something is dead in your orchard, get rid of it. If you've got weeds, get them out of there. Don't think about weeds as providing refugia for beneficial organisms. Get those out of your planting. It needs to look like you could eat off the ground. And then you're going to be good. You're going to have good air circulation. You're going to avoid this. This is a planting here. It's an organic apple orchard in New York. You can tell that because they can't use treated lumber. And it was in a low spot. They have a bunch of really productive rows up high, but they still wanted to push down into this lower wet area. And what ended up happening here is the trees got water stressed. Then they brought in these ambrosia beetles that'll bore into the tree and drill their way through, killing things because they're attracted to the ethanol from the stress. And then on top of that, the wound then brought in a plethora of diseases. And then the bad part is, yeah, they lost all the use of these rows. But what's worse about it is they increased the disease pressure for the rest of their planting. These are weeds gone wrong. I mean, this is a mess. Clean all of this stuff out. You can see that most of the verticals are uprights, and then it's not going to do a lot of good fruit. You want that jack looking level. Looks like a toy jack that you would have as a kid with a little rubber balls. That's what you want your trees to kind of look like at a very basic level. 1 liter, not 100. This is like mow the ground. Diseases love all of this stuff. Why does mine look like this? Because I have field trials that I'm trying to create lots of disease so I can tell growers which pesticides and biopesticides work the best in New York. Next, all right, this is the trickiest one. Use less susceptible cultivars. I'll probably send this talk to Kyle and he can pass out the slide decks. You can click on this link here to my colleague of Ace and see which cultivars are good, which cultivars are good for fire blight, which cultivars are good for apple scab. You'll notice that stuff like cedar apple rust and powdery mildew has no blanks in it. That means no one has been developing or knows about these, but you might have some anecdotal information about which of your varieties get the worst. There's not a lot of options for disease resistance outside of the apple scab and the fire blight realm. Most of it's in the apple scab realm. So if you don't have apple scab, this isn't going to be that useful. In this case, you're going to want to buy the varieties that people want to eat the most. But when you get to these other things, like this gross fly speck sooty blotch, this nasty bitter rot, which kind of looks like someone torched the apple, this is on the tree. You're going to need you're going to want to know about the susceptibility of these if there are any information. You may not have a lot of choices, but these things can show up and wreck your fresh market harvest pretty quickly. No one wants to do processing apple anymore. It's not a good business model. Go for the fresh for whatever you're doing. Here's some more here. You can kind of see some popular cultivar. Cortland's an ancient one, and this is for fire blight, moderately resistant. Oh, look, the old Crimson Crisp. It says it's moderately resistant to fire blight. Highly resistant to apple scab. Look at that thing. Oh, so some of these things are pretty good. Susceptible to, what was that one again? Cedar apple rust. If you have rust, maybe don't plant that one. But you'll see this list from this link has lots of different options, and you can click on them all. Sanitation. This is a big one. This is how to start off everything right. In my orchard, I want it dirty and as filthy as possible so I get so many diseases so that I can see which products are going to fail under bad situations. But what you want to do is all this fruit drop that's underneath the trees. In this example, this is in Brazil, of all places. And the reason I show this is because they have a tool. The 2 videos here will take you to a link that shows you a tool that first sweeps all the garbage out from underneath the trees into the row middles, and then they send something down the center and just wipe it all out. Leaves, fruit. Fruit are bad because they bring in deer. They bring in all kinds of little voles and other, in our case, we have what are those things called? Groundhogs. That's right. The silly groundhogs. They're not telling us about when winter's over. They're just eating the apple trees. And yeah, you can put guards up, but you know what? If you get the rotten fruit out of there, you won't need to see them nor the diseases that live on them. Huge accumulations of inoculum. If I did this in my orchard, all my fungicide trials would look terrible because the disease would be so low. So you can take that as a point to make sure to clean it up yourself. The tool has got, I would click on the video, but I don't know what the heck is going to happen if we do this live. So we'll skip that one for now, but you can get a copy and look at it as well. You don't have a tool. Let's say you don't have a tool. What you can do is then you can do leaf shredding by raking any number of farm implements into the middles and wreck those things up. You do it in the fall or spring. The easiest one is the urea application at 40 pounds per 100 gallons. If I'd say per 100, that's assuming a concentration of 100 gallons. Or you can do dolomitic lime. I personally like this one. If you get it on you, it'll burn like fire. But what you know when you have that feeling is that the microbes in the soil are also burning like fire, and that's what you want. You want to get rid of those dumb things. You can put this on the ground in the fall or spring. You might be asking, which is better? Well, it depends on when you can drive into your orchard. If it is not too muddy, then do it in the fall. If it's not too muddy in the spring, do it in the spring. But you want to get this on a couple months before the tissues start to leaf out, and that's real important. And then even when you're moving into the future, we showed this rather big growth tree from an old style planting. You want to make that first copper application at silver tip. And right around the time, and you don't want to use one of those lightweight coppers that's like mixes like water and rolls right off the tree. You want to use something pithy like a Coside or a Badge, and it will tell you on the label what % copper equivalent it has. It's called an MCE. It's like percent copper equivalent. And then this is a 15%er. Stuff like Cueva is a nice soap, and it works great for fire blight and stuff later on, but it's like a 3 or 4. You want something that's 15 or higher to really get in those buds. And what that copper is going to do, it's going to get in the buds, it's going to get rid of bacteria, it's going to get rid of fungi, so that your applications, if you spray a lot, will be better. If you don't spray that much, then you won't need to spray that much because you killed a lot of the stuff right off the bat. And that's sort of getting you started. Now, I don't know if you have apple scab, but unfortunately, I'll talk about it anyway, unless I see something pop up in the chat that says to stop. And this is a bigger problem in cool, wet production regions. So if your climate is more like Seattle, you probably see a lot of apple scab. I know they have it in different sides of Oregon, depending on where they are. Big problem in cool, wet, temperate production regions. Other countries have different diseases that are taking the forefront of this one, but you'll see it. As you can tell, it will immediately ruin a fresh market crop. Right there, that one lesion on it that takes your apple out of the grocery store and throws it in the trash. If a marketer finds 3% of apples with this kind of garbage on it, they will just dump all of your fruit and you're out of business. So there's a lot of susceptible cultivars, a lot of things that we like to eat that get bred for taste, color, and storability. You notice I didn't say the word disease. That's usually secondary. They want the things to look good, store well, and taste great. If we had more government funding for disease-resistant plants, then we would be able to add that trait onto the pile. But right now, plant breeders are doing the best they can to get us something that we want to eat. In New York, you're looking at about 10 plus fungicide applications a year. And historically, in the eastern United States, we have burned out most of the fancy single-site fungicide chemistries, except for the group 7. What's a single-site fungicide chemistry? What these do is they target genes, specifically in fungi, and knock those out so that I could squirt it in my mouth, because I'm not a fungus, and nothing would happen, and you squirt it on a plant, and it kills just the fungi, which is pretty darn cool. However, this still is considered a conventional material and cannot be used in organic production. Womp womp. But it is very effective, and these are very nice, but unfortunately our consumer base doesn't want them anymore. That's a different story entirely. So what about apple scab? This is what one of my big filthy orchards looks like now. This is a tall spindle planting. Look at how far apart I put the apples, and that's just so that I don't get junk moving between fungicide trials when we start doing treatment programs. The apple scab will sleep, if you will, or overwinter on leaf litter on the ground. You notice there's not a lot of leaves there. That's still enough to do the job for this nasty little microbe. On those leaves, buried into it, picked up, sectioned under a microscope, is this little structure here, and it's a fungus, and it's full of these things called ascospores. And as the plant begins to mature, boop, and spring and break buds, this silly thing has evolved to be in sync with your apples and will start ejecting these spores into the sky. And that's why if you get that copper on early at silver, before you see green tissue, the copper will be waiting for these silly things to land. Once they land, they'll cause these really early lesions, and they'll sporulate again, make a second type of spore, and then the mess continues all summer long like a COVID pandemic, just rising exponentially as more and more stuff gets affected. And I can tell you how to stop the exponential rise very briefly, and it'll work for any fungal disease pretty much. Now, what this one is, it doesn't go very far. It's just going to be, it will be everywhere, but your specific population will be just to your farm. Spread is local. It's only going to go a couple 100 feet at most. Most of the times, these spores are going to fly and hit a tree leaf, and then you're done. And all your management practices that you do will only affect your population, unless you bring in a bunch of someone else's dirty leaves. I mean, I don't know why you do that, but that's how to spread this stuff around. So what this means, if you've created fungicide resistance on your farm, farm next door is probably okay as long as they did different practices. So now here comes a rather complicated, silly looking graph. We got this thing on the side that's what we call disease progress curves for the modern epidemiologist, and what we have over here is a life cycle that I drew to help explain how we beat these things out and why you want to do basic disease management first. So in a normal sense, apple scab incidence, which means the percentage of apple scab lesions on fruit or leaves, in our case we're mostly concerned about the fruit, would go from about 0 to 100% apple scab on everything. And if you do nothing, in a wet climate like New York or Massachusetts, or heaven forbid, if you try to do this in North Carolina, you're really going to be crying. This thing will just ramp up, and it will do those early infections, and then it will start making these secondary infections, and then the exponential increase will just come flying right out to harvest. Now, however, if you do these things before the season, like you put out that urea, you remove the leaves, what this does is it takes that same stupid exponential curve, because the fungus is going to behave the same, it's going to have an exponential phase, and pushes it closer to harvest. So if you do that, you push it a little bit so that you end up with 80%. This is all theoretical. You add copper in there, pushes it even more. Maybe you're doing it 70%. If you clean up all the garbage, spray copper, and keep those leaves really good and keep all your stuff mowed and your everything beautiful and clean, you could only be looking at dealing with 33% of this disease. And this is going to be the case for almost any other disease. So this thing lives in the ground, it fires those little ascospores up, you've covered your opening tissues with copper, bam, they get killed. It does not lead to the secondary fruit infection and other leaf infection. If you don't manage it early on, this can spiral out of control all summer long, and then these leaves get colonized, they fall back on the ground, and then you're back again. You might ask, well, what happens if I start applying fungicides in the middle? Well, that's a great question. So, what this does in the epidemiological sense is if the first thing pushes the curve closer to harvest, the second one takes the curve and flattens it, if you will. So what you'll be doing is I recommend a lot of single-site fungicides. Bloom to second cover works best for apple scab. Once we start talking about other diseases, you're gonna, I might shift this recommendation. So if you don't have apple scab, for goodness sakes, don't do this. But the same principles apply. So the rate of how fast this curve grows is this little tiny R. And if you just do the protectant fungicides, which is what we recommend after copper, we say, hey, keep up with Captan, Mancozeb until bloom, or until the EPA takes them away. But there are other solutions for that. Captan's going, Mancozeb might go. It's very terrifying for the modern East Coast apple grower. But if you do that, and then you come on and you just do this only, you might have a pretty steep curve. But if you start taking these curves, and what they have is anti-sporulent activity, these single-site fungicides, stop it from sporulating. So they'll start flattening. So the idea being that if you do a full season program with anti-sporulent, you have a really flat curve. And if you pair this with the previous curve, you pretty much have no disease by the time you get to harvest. And you could care less whether apple scab develops inside on the fruit once it's in the consumer's stomach. That's no longer your problem. You're all good in that particular instance. So, for apple scab, we still recommend resistant cultivars. If you don't know any, I can tell you a bunch of ones off the bat. These are the most palatable ones. And I say, oh, palatable? What does that mean? No one wants to eat this junk. No consumer wants to buy it. They don't have apple scab. You can practically produce them organic if apple scab is a concern. You might ask, do they get other diseases? Oh, yeah. They get all the other diseases. And so you're like, well, that's silly. I need one that's resistant to all of them. There is no such thing, so you might as well plant the cultivar you like most. I found that topaz is pretty tasty. Gold Rush, if you can get it to grow right, is pretty tasty, but it has a very, a little more challenging. And of course, the classic Honeycrisp, which is often loved around the world, is pretty resistant to apple scab for a variety of different reasons. However, Honeycrisp will rot on the tree with some of the other diseases I'll show you. So a lot of these have a gene called RVI6 in them. It's a naturally occurring apple gene, and it only does apple scab, and it does not do any of the other diseases we're going to see today. So it's just apple scab. So in that case, if you got that one, Honeycrisp has some different ones. These have the RVI6 gene. You might ask yourself, can we pick the RVI6 gene up, stick it in another apple? It's an apple gene. Let's just put it in a different one. Yeah, you can. We're not there yet. Culturally, so I've done that. Yep, I made it. I made Macintosh resistant to apple scab, and then I throw the things in the autoclave and nuke them because no one's going to grow it, no one's going to eat it, because technically, even if it's apple to apple to apple, it's still transgenics. So we're not there yet, so we're leaving that behind. We've already done the sanitation. I'm not going to waste your time by talking it again, but I will emphasize the easiest way to do this is 40 pounds of urea, feed grade urea, looks like little tiny prills, and 100 gallons of water. Don't get it on yourself, don't get it in your gloves, definitely don't get it in your eye. And I understand that it is organic approved, so if you have an organic, use the same one you would buy for your organic pigs or anything else and put that in your tank. If you put this through an air blast sprayer, rinse the heck out of it because it will corrode your sprayer pump, and then you'll be quite sad. We've already talked about the copper and how wonderful that is. We don't need to see this again. Sort of moving along early on in the season, I like to tell growers to focus on copper, Captan, Mancozeb. And when you get to the later parts, bloom the second cover, that's when we'll bring in the fancy single-site fungicides. They come in 3 different groups. DMIs, it's the same group of fungicide, targets genes and fungi. It's so safe that this is the only group that's in our over-the-counter antifungals that you can buy at Walmart. So if you got a yeast infection on your tongue or somewhere else, you'll be getting a demethylation inhibitor fungicide to put on the problem. QOIs are pretty much cyanide for fungi, but not cyanide for people, birds, and mammals. Great. Same with the SDHIs. These things pretty much stop the fungus from being able to respire and kill it right there, making them wonderful for antisporulation. And now, how to make all of these things work even better is the disease forecasting systems. These are pretty ubiquitous. We use them a lot in New York. I have a podcast and I do a YouTube video and I go through all the different regions of New York and I tell them what to spray, when, and where. They can do it themselves, but the problem is if you have 500 acres of apple and 1 human being and sprayer, you kind of need to be on the sprayer spraying, and you can listen to me tell you when the day is. Very easy while you do your other farm management. If you have an inspired youth in your household that may like the internet, you can try to convince them that this is some form of social media, and then perhaps they'll use the predictions for you. It's very easy. It tells you the dates. It tells you the start date of the model. It tells you how many ascospores are in the air, and you can see all these other features. You won't have access to this one, but you can indeed reach out to the NUA coordinator at Cornell and get access to various forecasting models that we have out of Cornell. We have it all the way out in Utah. I think there's a couple places that now have subscribed to the NUA system. You just get a bunch of growers together, you pay one fee, it's probably somewhere around $3,000 for a state in the United States, and then you're cooking with gas. It'll tell you when the spores are mature, when they're ejecting, and when the infection events are happening. It takes the last 2 days, and the rest of the days are forecast. So it'll tell you exactly when things are getting dark. I'll also let you know when the rain was. You can see here, well, that was the easy part of the scab period. There's no little rain spikes. You can see that stuff coming up. Everything is nice and color-coded. I show a rather beautiful event here, letting you know that if you thought, well, it's Monday morning, better go spray, you'd be like, wait a minute, no infection. I'm going to walk away, and then I may spray that Friday because that is really going to increase your precision and really make sure things are working well. All right, and it will tell you warnings. It will work in forecast mode, but it's only as good as the weather forecast for rain, which we all know is variable. It could be sunny outside right now and might suddenly rain. Over here in New York, it might suddenly snow. Might suddenly snow there. You never know. Predicting weather and water is very challenging. But the nice thing about it is you can put a weather station on your farm and it will give you very accurate to your farm level data. Or if a rampaging deer or disaffected youth decides to trash your weather station, it will even bring in satellite weather data from NOAA and run the algorithms on that while your other system is down until it gets fixed, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool. So what does it do? It predicts when those first spores are flying, and it really only focuses on the first spore stage. I mentioned a second spore stage. It doesn't predict that one, but I can tell you now that they all like water, and they like lots of water in cool weather. So knowing that, you can still kind of use the model to determine when you're going to beat the second spore stage as well. The one thing about this model, it gives you just basic information. Trying to predict this stuff with any more accuracy is pretty much silly. You might as well rely on magic or something else if you really want to feel confident about that. There's no really way to predict this down to the wire, but you can get good estimates of when these things are mature and when they're flying. And a lot of these fungi are going to behave very similarly. We use very conservative data. As you know, it's hard to predict rain more than 1 to 2 days out, so it puts a lot less weight on 3 to 5, but you kind of need to watch it. Or hire a disaffected youth in your house to check it as they're looking at their Instagram scroll or something. All right. So, all these things are really doing is predicting favorable conditions in which the pathogens will cause infection. they may toss out a lot of infections for you to be worried about. But what I always tell growers is that, yeah, if you got a couple coming in the week, see when the biggest and nastiest one is. They will color code it in red and put some numbers. Right now, if you have apple scab, we recommend using the single site fungicide when you're going to get a big event, about 20% ejection. Or if you don't have all this junk, 2 inches of weekly rain. If you're going to have a 2-inch of rain, that's when you worry about it. If you don't, you could probably use a biological pesticide and be perfectly fine. If you're spraying in advance, use common sense. Treat this thing like the GPS. Don't drive into a lake, even if it's telling you there's a McDonald's around the next corner. Don't do it. Just always use common sense. If it says it's raining and you look out your window and you don't see rain, something is not right. The only other thing to be very careful is always waiting to spray after an infection period. It's historically known that we've been able to select for resistance in populations much more quickly if we spray after they start infecting. So, with all that, this is sort of my overview for a lot of the early season groups. We put the apple scab in here. You might see things like rust and apple leaf blotch, powdery mildew, other really awful stuff. And this is sort of where I recommend putting all the different fungicides, copper, urea. Copper, we bring copper all the way out the half-inch green and not getting a lot of injury. And then we're bringing in a lot of the Captan, Mancozeb, and a mix of the half maximal rate of both in a product called Captazeb that we mix ourselves in the tank. Take a half of this and half of that, mix that together, and you get fungicides that redistribute well and also have the sticking power of a Mancozeb. And then the EPA may remove these, but you know what? There are other options. Dodine is a very valid option, but it is a type of single-site fungicide that is only really good on apple scab and wipes stuff out. The other things we're recommending you bringing them in later if you have to do these. For they get the apple blotch, they get the powdery mildew, and they get the rust. And then they'll get any other scab that you got running loose. Let's talk about the nastiest disease of apple in the entire world. Fire blight, everyone's least favorite. In New York, it's getting worse for the most part. The problem is when you switch to a high-density, tall spindle super planting, you get these really expensive apple orchards. Pretty pricey, about 1,000 to 1,200 trees to the acre. So each tree is about $15 to $20 with inflation coming in. And if they all die the first year, not only have you lost the cost of the trees, you've lost all the labor and everything else. The high-density plantings, this is still sort of a tall spindle type, are very young, productive. They're kind of like caged chickens popping out eggs and stuff and food. They're kept really juvenile. They're kept really pushing really hard. Lots of vigorous shoot tissue, and fire blight loves vigorous shoot tissue. It's a bacterium. It just wants to see growing shoot tissue, and it's just going to wipe stuff out. You can graft your top of your tree. This is a tree at a germplasm repository of a rare apple cultivar that is dying from fire blight. You can see all the death and stuff over there. You can graft this onto a resistant rootstock, but as you can tell, once the whole top of the tree is dead, you'll be better off replanting than trying to regrow it. So we often tell growers they're great. They can prevent you from having a catastrophic loss early on if a root sucker gets infected, but once you get to the middle, it's bad, real bad. And almost everything that we want to eat or sell to the consumer is highly fire blight susceptible. This thing will rage through it. If our weather continues to get warmer and more tropical, the bacterial diseases like this will be bad. And in New York, we're seeing a lot of warmer seasons from petal fall to terminal bud set. And right when the flowers come off, I'll show you in a little bit, when things get really bad and things get dark. So in New York, we've been having a lot of bad trouble. So we have a still pretty nice cold bloom, wonderful. Then we get this hot petal fall, and then we get these nasty shoot blight epidemics where the orchards are entirely lost. And some people might think, well, it didn't rain. It doesn't have to rain. They have fire blight in Washington State all the time. You can get dew from grass, you can humidity of a thick canopy, or even the water of another pesticide application will do it. And this is a shot from one of our predictive models in Western New York and the Lake Champlain area, and you can see, like, oh, here's the water. It's dry, wrecked with fire blight. It's all dew on the ground. Bad news. We even have apple orchards in Long Island in eastern New York. Yeah, that's right, the thing off the coast of New York City. Now they're different. Everything's earlier, making it a little more challenging, a little warmer, and they sort of dodge these types of things from time to time. But you never know what kind of weather you're going to be dished. So how does fire blight work? starts on the flower. It's a bacteria moving in the air. It's endemic. That means it's just naturally in apple orchards waiting for your flowers to open and eat, and it will cause a systemic infection leading to this nasty thing that'll move through the tree and kill stuff. How do you beat it? Antimicrobials. Right now, you can use streptomycin for it and a couple other antibiotics. It's only a matter of time before the EPA pulls them. So what are your other options? There are some good biologicals. Oddly enough, there's a couple out there that do pretty well. You can get plant growth regulators, PGRs, and defense inducer applications. Ramp up the defenses to try to stop this nasty thing. Once it gets through the flowers, you're looking at this, and then if your tree is small enough, goes straight and kills the entire tree. This is the shoot blight phase, if you will, and that's the blossom blight phase. You beat this by trying to prune it out, and you try to use defense inducers and the PGR, perhexadione calcium, marketed as Apogee or Kudos, depending on where you're buying it from. And what this does will slow the tree down. We'll talk a little bit about, I don't know if we talk about how it works. I think I'll show some recommendations later because fire blight's really deadly. Rootstock blight, if you're not planning on a resistant rootstock, you probably should buy trees only on resistant rootstocks. They have a variety of vigors, and you can get one resistant rootstock for almost everything. If a sucker pops out of the ground here and gets fire blight, it goes straight to the tree and kills things very quickly. So you still want to have those resistant rootstocks in there. If you're on a susceptible one, sometimes it seems that infections go to the rootstock faster, kill the tree more quickly, and are more devastating than even normal plant on a susceptible scion on a resistant rootstock is still much better off than susceptible scion on susceptible rootstock. Trauma blight, if you have hail, animals, wind, the fire blight's here, it can get in there and cause trouble. This happens, you hit them with the copper, you hit them with the antibiotics, and then you walk away. All right, this is the epidemiological picture of silly fire blight. You're like, hey, wait a minute, looks a lot like the apple scab one. So how does fire blight get started? It's always present. It might be in old cankers. And as you get water warming up, they ooze like crazy, and then they'll float through the air with wind and rain and or insects, and they'll head straight for the flowers. They'll multiply on the stigmatic surface of the flower, get washed into the floral cup, kill the right through the pedicels, one over here. Next thing you know, they're moving through your apple tree like a water slide at a theme park. And when there's too many of them, they're just going to burst out of the tissue and make an ooze droplet. Pollinators, particularly flies, really love the taste of fire blight ooze. It's very, very sweet and tasty. You could probably use it as a salad dressing if you had enough of it. But the flies, they love this salad dressing, and they'll take it and they'll go visit another flower. They'll go visit another shoot. And if this is oozing here, and then even a branch barely touches, a young one touches a guide wire, rubs up a little bit on it, bam, you're in trouble, infection. And then these things will just sleuth to the active growing portions of the crop. Sometimes you might even see them oozing out of fruit, leading to shoot blight and death of the crop. How do you beat this? These cankers here, you want to get rid of them. Do your winter pruning. If you have active fire blight in the summer, wait till the coldest day possible, or driest, and cut that thing out. That silver tip copper that we recommended for apple scab will also get rid of the fire blight hiding inside crooks and crannies, especially when they start to ooze. Copper is only protectant, so it's only going to kill the cells that are there. And so what you might end up seeing is like with fire blight, the apple scab, the more you do to reduce this initial inoculum, you're going to push that curve all the way to the end of the terminal bud set. In this case, once the tree has stopped growing, the fire blight can't infect. I've tried to smear fire blight like a paste on a stopped growing apple tree, and I just can't get it to infect to save my life. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get to where the tree stops growing, and then the susceptibility to fire blight drops radically. And then, of course, you can just do a lot of stuff with inoculum reduction. But what about putting the junk on at bloom to stop this phase? And that's where your smashing of the curve comes in. As we've kind of seen here, you can put some antibiotics and biologicals on. They kind of still push the curve a little bit because they're going for the primary infection once the flowers are off, but you can have multiple infections within those windows if it's hot and aggressive enough. And so these will kind of flatten your curve. But they mostly will push to the end, kind of like we see here, where if you put them on, you manage the bloom infection, you're pretty good. Now, if you can't, what are SARs, PGRs, and pruning? That's defense inducers, this is plant growth regulators, and that's just getting the junk out. They're going to stop these oozing materials from showing up. In that case, they flatten that curve. So if you do a full season program, when you have bloom protection in there, you pushed it way down, and then you smushed it with all your hormones and your pruning and your defense inducers and flatten that thing to the bottom. What does perhexadione calcium do? It thickens the cell wall so that the silly bacteria can't invade and rip through the tissue. To put it in a very simple sense. So, beating this thing, try to pick the best cultivars. There's not a lot of single gene resistance in our popular cultivars. Some get less than others. Use resistant rootstocks. The Geneva series of rootstocks, I don't care if you buy rootstocks from Cornell Agritech or not, but most of the fire blight resistant ones and a lot of the resistant rootstocks used worldwide or the Geneva series at Cornell Geneva where I'm located right now. The B9 is also another one, but you can get a lot of very interesting growth traits as well as disease resistance from this series. And many of you probably already have trees on these things. And as I remember, doesn't matter what it is, if the thing is all the way covered, get rid of it. This becomes like a child sprinkler toy of fire blight. Once water hits this, it's just going to spray fire blight around the orchard everywhere and infect everything else. Rootstock or no, get that out of there if it hits the center leader. What do you do at the end of the season before it gets too snowy like now and you can't see them anymore? Oh, I'll just go through here and remove these fire blight shoots. Are you too busy? You prune out all the small strikes and cankers you can see now. You can just leave them on the ground. Once it gets to this stage, like our orchards look like now, you don't know which is dead and which is alive anymore. Here you know. There you don't. But you can leave the prunings on the ground. It's perfectly fine. You won't get more fire blight. The fire blight can stand a lot of really cold temperatures. It can't stand drying out. So if you want to lose a tree, but you don't have time to remove it, you can cut it off right there and let it hang. Once the tree is dead, it stops growing. Fire blight's locked out. Pre-season, look for this. You see this ugly thing like I drew a picture of earlier? You might want to move the tree because this is a lot of inoculum. All that's not oil. That's not some kind of goop or lotion smeared on a tree. That's fire blight ooze. And this is just going to spray around and get everything once we have a rain. You might not be able to see them all. The problem is it shows up every year because there's old flowers and other junk and tiny pruning cuts so numerous and hard to see. That's why we start with the copper. Again, really like that 15% or higher metallic copper equivalent. Once it starts warming up before bloom, these things ooze, and then you just kill them with the copper. Now we're recommending the perhexadione calcium a little bit earlier. And what we'll do in this case, let's see, I have a picture of a flower popping back here. We'll go back a little bit real fast right here. Is we put on this growth regulator now because what we want to do is thicken this up right here. So if this becomes infected later, it's so thick that the fire blight can't move down into the pedestal and kill your flower. So that's why we're recommending a little bit early to get on a little bit of this growth regulator perhexadione calcium. If your tree's kind of big, use 6 ounces per 100 gallon. Seems to be one of the best combinations at this point is perhexadione calcium, kudos, apogee, whatever, plus a little bit of this defense inducer Actigard, acyl or benzoyl S-methyl at 1 ounce per 100. This combination seems to be slightly synergetic, which means 1 plus 2 equals 4 instead of 1 plus 2 equals 3. You get that much more disease control out of it. It takes that pedestal cell wall, sticks it up, and prevents the systemic invasion of the bacterium. Oh, here's a picture from one of our studies. I guess I should have kept clicking. Cut that right there. You can see these cell walls. What the bacterium is trying to do is get its effector, this sort of molecular warfare tools into the different cells, and they just get so thick that they can't invade, and it stops the whole thing. And so we'll start these at tight cluster to pink, right when the flowers look like, and you're in pretty good shape. Once you get the bloom, it's all about using a model forecast. Models will tend to predict a lot of infections, but you're probably only going to need about 3 applications to get to petal fall. I've learned from my own trials you really only need one really big one at the hottest, wettest weather. And always use any models and common senses with consultants. And we'll talk a little bit about forecasting. There is a forecasting option on the West Coast. Predicts bloom infection, which starts the whole thing off. If you can get the materials on here before you see this happening, this is early blossom blight, then you've won. If this happens, and it might be too late to do anymore. You might be asking, I see dead flowers all the time. How do I know if it's fire blight? If you take one of these and give it a tug and it stays on the cluster, it's bad news. Obviously, if you see ooze, like that little tiny droplet, it's also bad news. If it stays put, it's dead with fire blight. Falls off in your hand, natural thinning. So these models will help you track shoot blight, but they're really focused on getting that. And they're the best practice for avoiding any sort of antibiotic resistance if you're trying to guess when to put on your streptomycin. The nice thing about it is they work pretty well. They use heat units and the presence of moisture. It has our model that we use out of NUA has 2 fire blight models in it. It first has the Cougar Blight, the newest Cougar Blight model, Logic from WSU, by my talented colleague Tiana DuPont, who has brought this model into the 21st century. It works really well. We've got all her stuff in there, so you can use the West Coast model. And if you're a grumpy East Coast person and you seem to think that East Coast only works, then you can use the epiphytic infection potential model, which is based on Mary Blight there. Scientific studies have shown that no one is better than another, so use whatever one you want. As you can see, they often in agreement. Green is good, red means trouble. And if you were starting into this week, you'd be like, oh no, this looks like a bad day around May 20. I'm going to make sure I'm going hard on the 19th. Just like with all the other stuff, they're integrated. They have limited input. You put in your blossom date, you check the day, you pick your weather station, and then this table pops up and you're looking at red. What are we recommending now? Most of our colleagues are recommending that, particularly with the EIP, check with Tiana if she has thresholds for Cougar Blight, but I would say probably about over 4 to 500 you're probably going to want to use streptomycin or casugamycin with Cougar Blight. Over 100 with the EIP, you're probably going to want to cook with an antibiotic. Oxytet is not as strong. It's about on par with the biopesticide, so you choose you in that particular instance. Some people mix them, which is a great tactic to avoid resistance. About 40 to 70 for a biological. So always with these things, watch out. They tell you when conditions are favorable. Yeah, it's not going to predict failures or future crop. It just can't stop to tell you what's going to happen if bacteria get inside. It's a guessing game at that point. It can predict only weather conditions for that blossom infection. So injury at insects and animals and windy storms, you're probably just going to want to apply something to not lock those things out. We have noticed that you spray less and you get more bang for your spray if you use application when the weather's conditions are favorable. I had an extension scientist friend that would say if I work out in the apple orchard and my sweat in the back of my neck builds for about 40 minutes of work, that's time to spray. I still lean to one of the 2 models. They're both very good. And then if you want the best bang for your buck, I always say use the models for the application timing. What do you spray for these things? If you don't have streptomycin resistance, but you are on the West Coast, which is pretty prevalent, here in New York it's still a little bit rare. We recommend hitting it with the highest rate, 24 ounces per acre. I put this in gray because in many instances I'm talking to organic people. Don't use this in organic. This is conventional only. The alternative, really nice material, is casugamycin. 64 ounces per acre. It costs more than liquid gold, maybe even liquid platinum. And I recommend start with strep and then bring this in second so you don't get any resistant. Watch out for this. Apply this in the evening. It will degrade very quickly in light and can break down. So don't put it on at the beginning of the morning and watch it get cooked all day and then lose your crop. Now if you don't, what if you're organic? What do? There's lots of biopesticides, defense inducers, and copper products that have low metallic copper equivalent, less than 15% copper. These work pretty darn okay to well. The best one across the board in all areas of the country is Areobasidium pullans, the Blossom Protect biological control, highly effective. At this, we usually look at those forecasts of the EIP of about 60 to 100, or maybe somewhere like 300 to 450 for a Cougar Blight. Look at wet weather during bloom. Put this on ahead of time, because what this thing does is this fungus will colonize your floral cup, and fire blight tries to come in. It's like, sorry, we're already here first. The club is closed. You're out. And it works very well. The USDA germplasm repository at Geneva, housing the living collection of hundreds and thousands of apples almost was destroyed by streptomycin-resistant Erwinia malavra, and between Blossom Protect and copper, we still have that resource for apples worldwide. So what else do we do? Very important, this is kind of a double-edged sword, the use of protexadione calcium after petal fall. This is where most of the problems occur. You can get through bloom really well, and then the next thing you know, you're looking at that, and you're like, oh, that means get the tractor out and push the whole row up. First, walk down here with a chainsaw and cut them all off at the soil line. Let them dry out. You don't want this to be the sprinkler system of fire blight for the row next door. It's gone. But to avoid this, right around petal fall, we're recommending that same 6 ounces per 100 gallon of protexadione calcium, Apogee, kudos, your choice. Or you can do the combo, petal fall and 10 to 14 days later. What we're trying to do in this state is slow down the growth. So if you've used this material and it's slowed the growth down too much, not good. If you haven't loaded enough and they're growing crazy, you're in trouble. If you're in a semi-arid environment, this is probably not a great tool for you because it doesn't seem to work very well, as it's related to slowing and stopping the growth. If you don't have a lot of vigorous growth, you're not going to have a lot of fire blight. But in this case, this might not be the best tool, and you're better off probably using some copper. As I mentioned before, it sort of thickens the cell walls in there. Fire blight can't move through and can't invade and can't kill your crop. You still try it. If the climate changes and you feel like the things are growing too fast, hit it, and you know what rates to hit it with. It can slow the growth of a young tree. You're struggling to get your tree to the top wire. If you get there and it's loaded with fire blight, it's game over. So it's a sort of a balancing act in our case. So what can you do afterwards? You can put on copper. If the PGRs don't work for you, be very careful with copper. You can fruit rust it. That's why I recommend those low MCE coppers. They're generally safer on the crop. Like there's a liquid badge that's pretty high. What do I like? The CS 2005. There's a couple others that I really like. Cueva's fine. All the really thin liquid coppers are great. There's a really pale blue one that I really like. It's a dark blue one that smells like ammonia. It's really good. I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but it's fantastic. It's probably just as good as an antibiotic. One of my favorites. Now I can't remember the name or who makes it. Oh well, what are you going to do? Be careful once you hit petal fall and your young fruitlets are forming, because you can burn them, but those low coppers that have good drying time, great. It only works on the surface. So if the tissue grows and oozes more, you're out of luck. And then, of course, if your crops grow too long, you'll run out of copper. Your residues won't be there anymore, and you've got potentially infected material. If you put the copper on there, it grew a foot, bam. If you don't have a lot of growth, you're doing great. A lot of people will put on a low fixed rate copper program, about 7 to 10 days schedule, just to get to the part where the trees aren't growing. You're good. If you have to cut out, this can be kind of scary. Pick the coldest, driest day possible. Cut at least 12 years into last year's tissue, into the healthy tissue. You can see, like, where was it? Oh, there it is. Gross. And then I removed it, and not into the first year wood, but into the second year wood, about 12 inches down. Bam. If it's 12 inches into the main scaffold, you should yank the tree and replant. You can try to rescue them with the protexadione calcium. But if you're sitting next to a CCE member in the Zoom meeting that says don't use protexadione calcium, doesn't work on the West Coast, don't do it. But here you can drop this on at a very high rate, wait 5 days, prune, and then do it again. Like, why do we have to do it again? Well, if you prune, it stimulates new growth, and it counteracts the effect of the slowing material. So we try to give it a little bit, and then hit it, stimulate it, shut it down again, and you're just trying to get to the part where the tree's not growing. So to summarize, with the awful fire blight, prune out cankers, copper, antibiotics and biologicals right around bloom. Keep your sanitation, very important. It works for all the diseases, even if you don't have apple scab. And then we really hit these defense inducers a little early, and the PGRs right around pink and pre-bloom. We're really trying to stop any vigorous growth. If you don't have vigorous growth, you're doing good. So we got about 6 minutes. What do I want to talk about next? Let's talk about powdery mildew. Sometimes it shows up in arid climates. We've done a lot of research on powdery mildew, and it has a couple troublesome features. The first troublesome feature is the primary infection. Blighted shoots and blossom clusters. Depending on the cultivar, you might see this, which I see in one of my orchards of John of Gold apples. It's like, oh, shoot emerged. It's just a shriveled powdery mildew shoot. Or in my Ida Reds, I'd be like, oh, a blossom cluster emerged. It's just a messed up bunch of flowers covered in powdery mildew. This is managed from the year before. What it ends up doing, boop, is making these spores that fly over and infect newly young succulent tissues that will sporulate again, sporulate so much in an exponential manner, just like the silly apple scab, and wreck the finish on your apples. And then you get this spider web looking nonsense, and someone thinks, is that a new variety or should I throw all the apples away? Sadly, they throw all the apples away and your apples don't get purchased. If you have any fruit blemish things, they think, oh, it's pesticides. Nope, just powdery mildew, but it doesn't matter because the person buying your fruit is the one who gets to make all the calls. So these spores are trying to infect your fruit and they fail and lead to a bad russeting condition early on. So you want to knock this nonsense out. This is really bad in warm, dry spring and summers. And if you're West Coast and you're in the arid area, you'll probably see this thing. Sadly, like everything else, we're not breeding for powdery mildew resistance intentionally. The plant breeders have to fund all their own programs on soft money. So what they need to do is they got to breed for taste or ability so that they sell enough of these varieties so they can buy and keep their programs running. If they focus on this trait, I don't know, we just need we need better funding from other sources. And then if this gets going, this will just run rampant all the way to harvest, and you'll have an apple tree that looks like it's ready for Christmas in July. It'll be a mess. And in our case in New York, we got to put fungicides on for mildew even in the summer. It's getting worse. Many instances it's gotten worse, and a lot of people think it's fungicide resistance, but fortunately it looks like everything is very susceptible. What it probably is irritating climate. In the old days, we could just put on one application of a DMI fungicide, that same group that we can use to treat our personal fungal infections, and it would just knock it out. You'd never see it. However, sounds like there may not be full-on resistance, but some mild intolerance. This is what my apple tree would look like in early August if I just let powdery mildew go. You can see leaves are missing. It's all white looking, and that's just all powdery mildew. It's just a mess. These are very good. This QOI fungicide group 3, the first ones came out a little bit later in the 90s, and they were really effective. Not as effective as the DMIs, a little more effective, but now they seem to be our best option. This group here are all the new single sites, those ones that target genes. They're all right. They're just not as strong as these. The third option is frequent sulfur applications, which isn't very attractive. And then once we figure out how to beat powdery mildew, I'll stop and let you guys ask questions or go to sleep or leave. But we'll get through this one first. This is our powdery mildew cycle here. Oh, they live inside buds, and when these buds break, pop, you get this ugly looking thing, a shoot. And this is from the previous season before, or you get a malformed cluster. These will make these conidia, and they'll just constantly infect in this exponential manner like every other irritating disease and cause more and more infections. So you might be thinking, if I clean up the trash early on, can I beat this? This trash is really hard to clean up because you can't see that this bud is infected. So what will end up happening is it gets close to the end of the season and plants are forming new buds. These spores will fly through the air and infect those young buds, and then they become filled with mycelium. You can't tell, and then you're over the winter. So the best thing you can do is to keep this down during the early season. How do you beat it? In theory, you could use some pruning. You don't know which one to remove. If something looks terrible, for goodness sakes, remove it. Does the copper work? Can you do any fungicides? I don't recommend a lot of fungicides prior to green tip, unless you were to do a delayed dormant sulfur instead of copper. I feel like that would get in the buds and do stuff, particularly that gross liquid lime sulfur that's sort of a pale orange red color and smells like someone opened the gates to hell below you. It's very sulfurous. It's very stinky. Liquid lime sulfur is unpleasant to spray, and I've had growers fund research on trying to find alternatives. Still a good product. How you beat this one? You got to go with those anti-sporulent fungicides. The DMIs are pretty good for that because they stop growth, and the QOIs are pretty good as well, and the SDHIs are all right. So we usually recommend targeting this a little bit after these periods would pop up. Depending on how this stuff shows up in your orchards, you might need to adjust these timings. I find that from green tip to pink, is protective fungicides don't do very much, but the bloom to second cover is the sweet spot for getting rid of mildew. You get a little bit of this burnt out, and you get a lot of that stopped. Second cover, or first cover, is about 14 days after petal falls for the New York jargon. And this will smush that curve so much that the plant stops growing and you're done. Not really good. Cap 10 Mancozeb are terrible. If I want to have a nasty treatment, I'll just that gets no apple scab but lots of mildew, I'll just put Cap 10 and Mancozeb in the tank. And the single site fungicides are the golden ticket. The only protectant that is good is sulfur, but I still recommend moving it on later into the summer. And once you get into that bloom, the second, third cover, DMI's best, QOI second, SDHI's third in terms of your material. There's not a lot of good models for this, so you're kind of just having to kind of go with the classic calendar scheme. But when you're putting stuff out for other fungal diseases that have a model, this can be helpful to use the same timings. You don't need to make second applications for powdery mildew. If you don't have apple scab, you only want to make applications for powdery mildew. This is kind of what it looks like. I might bring in maybe if you don't have fire blight, this is really good for fire blight, probably kill some powdery mildew. Sulfur can be the whole time if you really need extra mildew mashing, but I'd recommend getting a cultivar that doesn't get as much. There are some, and then really a couple of applications on here. We'll take these things and sort of smush that stuff. And we could talk about rust, but what I think I'll do is, since it's 2 o'clock on the dot, and I will open it up to questions, and I can bring up any number of other things.